Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technologies for putting out wildfire. You're going to see some really cool stuff coming up soon if you check out the teamwildfire.com website. I've got with us live from down under, early in the morning, on a rainy day, Rohan Fisher of Charles Darwin University. Rohan, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Yeah, good morning, Steve. Yeah, thanks for inviting me along this morning. I'm doing great, thanks.
Wonderful. So I know you do wildfire data stuff, and it's really easy for me to explain what we do because people can visualize what a wildfire is, and they can visualize it being put out. It's pretty straightforward. But when you talk about modeling and data visualization, that's a whole other challenge. Is that keeping you up at night?
It doesn't keep me up at night, but it gets me thinking. The landscapes I work in across the tropical savannas in northern Australia are the most fire-prone landscapes in the world, as are most tropical savanna landscapes. And fire is a intrinsic part of the environment here. Fire is not bad across most of Australia. And so trying to support the intelligent and sophisticated use of fire, it's one of the things that really keeps me motivated. And particularly in Northern Australia, we're really lucky. We've got around 60 or 70,000 years of continuous unbroken wildfire management from our Indigenous communities. So really trying to support that Indigenous knowledge and how that combines with new technology. We're actually seeing some of the best fire management outcomes in the world at the moment across Northern Australia, and something that, I'm really proud of and motivates the work I do.
So tell me about the Indigenous practices, which I didn't know had 60 or 70,000 years of experience behind them. How are those and you said you support them. I'm guessing that you also use them in areas where there are non-Indigenous practitioners. Is that right?
Yeah, so as I said, we live in these incredibly highly fire-prone landscapes, and fire is an annual occurrence across the majority of the tropical savannas. Really deeply intrinsic to the health of this environment is having fire. And these environments have co-evolved with human management over, as I said, many tens of thousands of years. What we did see through colonisation over the last couple hundred years was people being moved off their traditional lands. We often call country. People moved off their country. And a disruption of that traditional land management practice. People moving through the landscape throughout the year and burning the right places at the right time to reduce the impact of those more severe fires. So we are in a tropical monsoon environment. As you mentioned, it's a very rainy monsoonal morning, but throughout the year, going to the what we call the dry season, mid-June through to July, August, conditions for more severe fires slowly grow and grow as conditions dry and the temperature goes up. So a lot of this, what we call the early dry season burning, when everything's still green and wet, that is really maintaining, fire resilient landscapes and healthy landscapes. But as I said, there was a disruption to that traditional management over the last couple hundred years. It wasn't a total disruption. As I mentioned, there were still people using traditional management practice, but they didn't have access to the majority of their landscapes. And what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is a real resurgence in the application of good fire management at this vast continental scale. So we're looking at landscapes 2,000 miles, 3,000 kilometres across. So going from the far west coast right to the east coast, so from the Kimberley to the Cape York, as we'd say, people are putting good fire back onto country, but using all of the tools and the technology and that old traditional knowledge combined together. And an important component of that is the satellite imagery, which is mapping and monitoring those fires. And we've been doing that using satellite-derived data sets to support this traditional management practice for the last 20 years. And the concept, I guess, of what we're doing, for me seems obvious, but in other landscapes and other fire management contexts, we see fire not as an emergency management issue. It is first and foremost a land management issue. One thing which is fascinating, one thing is now underpinned a lot of the large-scale fire management across Northern Australia has been the introduction of a carbon abatement industry. So science has been able to show that by reducing the severity and frequency of fire, we reduce the emissions of a couple of key greenhouse gases, which are nitrous oxide and methane. It's often called carbon credits, but with these fires, as grass fires, they'll grow back each year. So the carbon comes back, but the severity of those fires also produces these other significant greenhouse gases. We've been able to show that a reduction in the frequency, extent, and severity of fires is able to reduce those gases, which is now underpins this really incredibly successful carbon abatement industry. So it's around $50-60 million a year, and that supports these Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups across Northern Australia working to get that fire back onto country using cars, helicopters, walking, people talking together, everything that they can to actually get fire, good fire, the right sort of fire, that nuanced, sophisticated fire back onto country. And what we've seen is a reduction in the frequency of fire over an area of 640,000 square kilometres.
Wow.
I just want that to sink in, because this, I think, is the most incredible human ecological achievement globally in terms of wildfire. And it hasn't been an easy thing to achieve. This has been decades of work, scientists working with those Indigenous land managers and knowledge holders, engineers developing new technology for the introduction for incendiaries into the landscapes, helicopter pilots learning about the country as well, and being key part of teams which are going out putting fire onto country, and lots of hot work. We live in a very hot part of the world, and people going out in the middle of the dry season, it can be 35 degrees up on these sandstone escarpments, and they'll be up there with rakes and leaf blowers putting out these fires where they've already put in strategic breaks. And I mean, the outcomes have just been remarkable. And the investment by particularly these Indigenous land management groups in the ongoing science and the ecology of good fire management, I think they're the hardest critics. But I'm watching them from space every day, and I see these outcomes, and it's incredible. And I think there's great lessons to be learnt. Across Australia, fires in remote and regional Australia make up 99.3% of all fires in this country. And all of those fires are very distant from our capital cities. So that 99.3% is largely ignored. It doesn't exist. There's this terrible word in Australia, you may have heard it, called the outback.
Yes. I thought that was a restaurant
means nowhere. It means we don't know about it. We don't really care. We're going to make myths about it, but it's not important because it's not near our capital cities. And it's the nature, and it's the same with fire and fire management. It's sort of these fires which are the 99% that we don't care about. But they're important. They exist. They're not destructive. They're not all bad. But they need to be managed, and we need to support, not exclusively, but particularly these Indigenous land managers, because they're the people who are primarily working in these really remote and difficult landscapes.
So you're kind of getting the best of both. You're getting 70,000 years of wisdom tied with 21st century technology.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, one of the key things which has enabled this is the provision of satellite-derived information. So, it was about 23, 24 years ago. Old Indigenous people out in some remote country near where I live were saying that we can see there's a problem with fire in these landscapes because we're not managing this country anymore. It's an unhealthy country. We need to manage that again. And we knew we could sort of show that and monitor the outcomes with satellite imagery. And so the work that we've done through North Australia Fire Information in providing these land management focused fire data, so current fire hotspot information, but also really accurate burnt area mapping updated weekly, has underpinned the fire management, and over the last 22 years has grown up with a lot of the Indigenous fire managers to become a key part of Indigenous fire management. So space technology is now considered a key component of traditional fire management practice. It's not a separate thing. And this, I guess, a two-way approach of using those tools and mutual respect around different knowledge systems and how they can combine together has really been critical to these outcomes. And I mean, I personally am a little bit cynical about technology at times because, there's a lot of tech utopian sort of speak around, what's the latest thing that's going to solve, these big human ecological crises. And
Right.
Tech is never going to solve these big human ecological problems that we have. It's always people, and it's always people working together. And if you don't have that as your underpinning, this basis of respect and listening, and then tech is a key component, but that's not the key thing. It frustrates me at times when I see these big sort of X prizes. What's the latest AI empowered early detection system? It's not real. It's not what is going to really change the nature of fire management and fire risk. It's around people having a better, what I call a better pyro-ecological understanding of the environments they live in. And that's a huge problem in this country, in Australia, where, as I said, most of fires occur in this word outback, in faraway land. So people don't have a very poor pyroecological understanding of the nature of fire in this country, and I think it's the same in your country as well. It's
Yes.
always seen as a reactive disaster, as opposed to understanding the deeper, sort of longer term pyroecological nature of the environment that you live in and how to build fire resilient landscapes. We always seem to be at the edge of fighting the problem when it's almost too late, rather than thinking about how we live in the places that we live in.
Proactive thinking is not well rewarded.
No, and often that sort of I guess more human and political engagement and education engagement, isn't as sexy as what's the latest tech.
Right.
But actually, that's where it's at, I think. And so a lot of my other work has been around making sure we have tools that enable that clear conversation between people and living in landscapes, whether they be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, doesn't really matter. Having those clear conversations around what fire is and what the risks it poses are, and how you can live in fire-prone landscapes safely. I think this is one of the key things. And so in terms of other work I do, which is around developing fire simulations for promoting these discussions. For me, it's much less about predictive simulations, but what I call descriptive simulations, describing what are the key driving aspects of fire behaviour in the particular landscapes you're looking at, and being able to open up those conversations around the complexity of fire behaviour. I mean, one of the things I love about fire is that it's simultaneously simple and incredibly complex. It's got these, there may be 3 or 4 key driving forces behind fire behaviour. So you've got your fuel loads, you've got your fire weather, and you've got your infrastructure, and the way that they interact produces complexity. It's incredibly complex behaviour, and there's very, very large industries that have been developed around predicting fire behaviour. But like predicting the weather in any complex system, we hit a point of where predictability sort of falls off very quickly. It interests me, you look back, I remember, 15, 20, 25 years ago, complex systems, chaos theory, unpredictability, ambiguity. We talked about those things. That it was part of the zeitgeist of what people were thinking about. Now we live in a much more uncertain world. We're looking for certainty more and more. We're hoping that the science will be able to predict our future, but we know it can't. We know that complex systems are inherently unpredictable, but we spend more and more money, and we have this utopian dream, that somehow AI or tech or big data or computing, that these things will save us. These things will somehow tell us the answer to these really complex and ultimately they're not unsolvable problems, but unpredictable problems. And the way that we solve them is engaging with people and having people talk together and think for themselves. And that's what I try to do through my work. It's where you can illustrate the principles of fire behavior. People, through understanding those principles, are able to look at patterns, able to look at those principles in their own context, and are able to understand uncertainty and complexity without having to be told, the black box, we put in these numbers, these are the outcomes. And so the work I do in this sort of fire simulation space, I call them more like fire simulation games. I'm less interested in predictability than I am in getting people to think through, what are the fire behavior issues that they need to think about and talk about with each other.
I remember when Einstein said, right, you have no chance of getting the right answer if you're not asking the right question. And if the questions we're asking don't take into account the complexity, then we don't really have a chance that we're going to get the right answer.
Absolutely. And I find that particularly with when people talk about fire, and the complexity of fire can be so many things. And the analogy I use sometimes, in the English language, we have one word to talk about fire, and that is fire. But as I said, fire is so many things. And it's sort of like, you go to a fine dining French restaurant, maybe you're in Paris, and the waiter comes, a sommelier, and he says, what sort of red wine would you like? Sorry, what sort of wine would you like? And you say, well, we'll have the red one. Well, we've got the 300 varieties of red. And he said, no, well, I'll just have the red one because that's the only thing I understand. That's the way we talk about fire. There's such a lack of sophistication and nuance in the way that we talk about fire when we use that term. And so I'm constantly having these conversations that are not connecting with people when I'm talking to people from sort of a much more a fire emergency background from, say, Sydney or Melbourne, or those states where they're fighting fires because they're impacting lives and infrastructure. And we're talking about completely different things. And they see fire as a problem rather than as a solution.
Right.
And yeah, I think that is that's an issue that we see sort of compounded around the world, where people talk about fire, but they're often talking about completely different things. And it's a lack of, I think, pyroecological education, as I say, and it's something that should be taught in primary schools. I'm on a bit of a personal mission myself, trying to see how I can get a better understanding of the nature of fire across the Australian continent in our primary schools and high schools, so we can have more sophisticated conversations around what fire is and how we need to prepare for it.
So when you talk to emergency people, big city folk, who are talking about the 0.7% of fires that occur in the country, from their perspective, those are all the fires. Those are all the fires they think about. And those are all the fires they care about. And that type of fire destruction in the built environment is really how they define fire.
Absolutely. And I'd have these conversations, and in no way am I trying to devalue the importance of those fires. And they're critical because they do impact infrastructure and life. And nor to devalue the work that they do, but they are not all fires. They're the fires where also 99.99% of the funding goes to as well, and there are good reasons for that. But these other fires, if you look globally as well, the vast majority of fire that occurs across the globe occurs in remote and under-resourced landscapes. And this idea that technology or firebombing infrastructure could ever tackle these sort of global fire issues is really not understanding the fundamentals of global fire ecology.
It's misdirected.
And once again, I talk about fire, and people would say, "Well, I know these fires are bad for the environment, but," and I would sort of say, "Well, these fires are the environment. They're not bad for the environment. These fires are the environment that we live in." It's sort of like saying that water is bad for the environment. Water is part of the environment. Fire is part of the environment. Water and fire are very closely linked. And it's how you engage with these things. And I think it's really fascinating. I mean, there's been in the province of conservation and environmental protection, there was a period which I think we're over, where there was this talk of wilderness, this idea that pristine ecosystems were those not managed by people, which was part of the problem of taking fires out of the landscape once again, and as if people were not ever part of the environment and haven't always been part of the environment. And was part of that same sort of colonial narrative which supported the dispossession of Indigenous people from the places where they live. So there's, it's a really fascinating mix between, the politics of colonisation and land management and fire, and all of these things come together in a fascinating way.
When you speak about the Indigenous wisdom that's been passed down, my first reaction is I'm afraid that wisdom will perish with the people who hold it. And I don't know to what degree that wisdom gets passed on, or whether we're at risk of losing 70,000 years of experience. But to what degree are we able to document, to share, to immortalize this wisdom so that it can be built upon and used in the future?
So I think one of the key things that, particularly the development of this landscape scale fire management work in Northern Australia, which has been supported by this carbon abatement industry, is the fact that that work is now well resourced. There has been some criticism that helicopter-based incendiary dropping is not traditional fire management. However, what it is doing is providing employment for people on remote landscapes to create more healthy environments across their traditional lands. And through the industry, it's also providing ways that these Indigenous ranger groups can get back onto country, both in helicopter but on the ground, walking with older people and doing those more traditional ground burns. So, and that's where you get, I guess, a more detailed transference of that sort of on-ground traditional knowledge between young and old is through those walking burns across country. And people can talk to particular plants and animals and what happened in the past. So the large-scale, primarily helicopter-based burning is not mutually exclusive, but in actual fact supports a lot of these on-ground sort of deeper knowledge transference activities. One thing that I started about a decade or so ago was developing these landscape scale fire simulations for savanna landscapes, and trying to support that intergenerational knowledge exchange through these simulations. I create 3D printed landscapes, large scale, and then project over them the simulations which describe some of the key interactions between fire weather, time since the monsoon, and time since fuel reduction work was done or big fires came through country. So they're the key elements that people are thinking about when they're talking about fire management. Then I'd create these 3D projection augmented spaces and take them into quite remote places out bush, as long as you had a genset, a generator, you could start up a projector and then project over people's country. And young people just loved it, even in quite remote places. Everyone's computer savvy. You get 6 or 7-year-olds sort of burning country and playing around. But then older people, often a bit unsure, but they had that deeper knowledge of country, but they had the kids there engaged. And I could leave. Often they'd be talking in a language that I didn't understand as well. So my involvement was wonderfully over, but I created this space that people could then talk together, young to old, about fire management and the history of that country. And in many places across the north, that tradition of fire management was also long broken, and the ability to actually get people out again and thinking about fire and re-establishing that connection to their traditional lands and re-establishing that fire management skills, incredibly important. And some of that knowledge of fire management is being reinvigorated, and sometimes it's being reinvented in a new way. But the important thing is sort of allowing people to get back out and with the old people and young people and be back on their country, looking after their country again.
It sounds like it's good for familial bonds as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let me take you back to what you told me about the reduction in the emission of gases from prescribed burns versus catastrophic burns. Over what period of time do they equalize? Would it be like one catastrophic burn releases the same amount of emissions that 30 years of prescribed burns would release, or how do you ratio that?
So the method that's been developed, actually, just step back for a second. So across the tropical savannas, there are, I guess we don't talk about catastrophic fires. I guess we talk about cool or hot burns.
Okay.
Those hot burns are more severe, but they're pretty much never canopy fires. So they're almost always grass fires. If you get big grass fuel loads, you'll get canopy scorch. So those more severe fires, you'll get canopy scorch and you'll get leaf drop, and occasionally you'll get trees die. But yeah, they're not catastrophic, large-scale forest fires as you'd see in North America or we might see in Southeast Australia. But so we go from what we call those cool, small-scale strategic burns, which are really low-level grass fires, to these more severe grass fires where you'll get canopy scorch. Now, the difference is I'd have to look back at the methodology, but the difference between a very severe fire and a cool fire may be 1.5 times the amount of emissions. It's not an order of magnitude. But what we're really trying to do is stop the extent of fires overall. So those more severe fires are usually the very large fires as well. So if you look across Northern Australia, moving into April, May, June, we get this massive effort of putting in these, I call it painting at the landscape with fire. So people using helicopters to essentially draw lines through the landscape to break up country. So when you do get those more severe wildfires later in the year, either they're pulled up directly by earlier burns, or you've created a landscape where it is actually possible to get in and to do some really minor work to shore up those pre-existing breaks to stop those fires going any further. So the way the method works, a project will apply to become part of a carbon abatement, greenhouse gas abatement methodology with our federal government. They will look back at a period, I think it is 5 years prior to their beginning of their project, and they'll get a baseline of early and late dry season fires, so the cool and hotter fires, estimate a greenhouse gas emission amount from that, and it's your reduction in that going forwards. But as I said, it's primarily through but by reducing the total extent of fire, but also the timing of fire, so you do have those cooler fires. The way the method works at the moment is we know that the majority of the landscape has dried off, and you'll get those larger and more severe fires after July. So we use a fairly hard cutoff that all the fires prior to July are considered cooler fires, and they'll have one calculation measure for the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and those fires after July, August onwards will use a slightly higher greenhouse gas emission calculation. I mean, it's a fairly coarse cutoff, but it's a method that people are able to work to. And as I said, what we can see overall, the outcome has been this massive reduction.
How do the fires know what month it is?
The fires, obviously not. And whilst there is that, cut off within the method there, people will burn to the timetable of the landscape. And as I said, that cutoff makes a difference, but not a massive difference to the ultimate outcome in terms of their calculations. What we've seen as well, which is fascinating, because there's been this resurgence, partially underpinned by this carbon abatement industry, we've seen overall a better understanding of fire management across Northern Australia. So even those areas not involved in these greenhouse gas emissions, we're seeing the whole landscapes get better fire outcomes, which is nice.
I participated, or I burnt off my land regularly in Texas. I'd burn off grasslands, and when I'd walk back through, I'd notice that the dried out grasses were gone and the healthy grasses were still there. So that would certainly, that type of presence would certainly explain why you have less emissions, less things are burning, because only the dry fuels burn. The healthier fuels remain and come back healthier. And when we say come back healthier, we mean they grow more, which means that they're absorbing more carbon in the process. Or when you have a massive burn through, or hotter fires, you'd say, you're losing the healthy vegetation as well as the dried vegetation, and you're losing the roots. So it's a very slow process before that land is once again turning carbon into plants.
That's right. And particularly, as I said before, if you're looking at the tropical savannas, the nature of the environment is that we have these intense but relatively short monsoon seasons going for 3 or 4 months. Then we have no rain for about 8 months. And that's what creates these incredibly fire-prone environments. The monsoon provides the water for the grass growth, and then we have these incredibly long dry seasons. So across the tropical savannas, we have an average amount of fire of around 40 million hectares. So that's an average season. In 2023, coming off a series of very wet years, as you go further south into the more arid country, it's the fire pulses are really driven by the La Nina, El Nino cycle. So where we get very, very wet years, we get lots of grass growth and we can have large fire seasons. 2023, we had 83 million hectares burnt. So I think that's around 1.2 times the size of Texas, burnt over a few months.
Is Texas the international metric of land scale?
No, it's one that I've translated for the purpose of this podcast today. Yeah, or in Australian, I think it's about twice the size of the state of Victoria. So
okay. Or 1/3 of an Alaska, right?
That's yeah. Right. So a really massive area. So 2023, I mean, globally, that fire event, was really very significant, and part of that proportion was the annual flux of fire that moves across the tropical savannas. But the other part was these sort of cyclic fires that move through our vast desert landscapes, which are build upon previous wet years. The issue that we're seeing in these desert landscapes is that we don't have the same ability to do the burning at a very, very large landscape scale to reduce fuel loads, to reduce the extent and severity of these fire pulses. And that's where we need to find methods to really expand that proactive fire management into these other landscapes. And it's difficult. It requires significant funding, and there may not be the same greenhouse gas abatement opportunities in the arid zone. But we still need to think about ways, if in Australia we want to live in a healthy continent, that we get healthy fire back into these landscapes. I developed a site recently. Maybe I can send you the link. You can post with the pod. But
Yes,
it's an animation. It provides animations of fire histories across the whole of Australia for the last 10 years, and you can really see the scale of these fires. But you can also see in detail the work and the detail of the work people are doing across Northern Australia. It's fascinating to watch.
oh, I'd love to see that, and I'll post the link on here. I've always found things are easy, people are hard, right? And it sounds like you have a division in your work between the science part, right? And we know if we do this, these are the likely outcomes, right? There's some, even though that's not your field, fire progression, fire prediction, is a science unto itself. For you, it's those are really more learning moments for people, or engagement opportunities. So I'm going to go to what's the harder part. How do you engender conversations about fire management, land practices that lead to thoughtful approaches, where people really step back from the idea that they understand what fire is, and to create that space where they're willing to say, "Oh well, I know so much about fire, but it's all about less than 1% of fire." And how do you get that conversation going in a way where people are willing to be open to realizing that they don't know much about fire at all?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's opportunities to talk about the nature of fire that I see. So like this podcast, but also doing taking the opportunity to talk at a national level through the media, I think is important for me to talk about what I understand of fire. So broadening that conversation for a start. But also, I'm really keen on developing tools that allow people to think about fire and the complexity of fire behaviour for themselves. And a nice example of this work was an engagement I had with our local fire management agencies, bushfires, Northern Territory, and they were really battling with getting rural block holders, so people living in that peri-urban landscapes outside Darwin, to manage a particular weed grass called gamba grass, which is a pasture weed which has come from Africa, been introduced to our landscapes. Good for cows, but produces these massive fire fuel loads and increases fire
They grow very
risk.
tall, right?
It is, yeah. So fuel loads up to 10 times more than native grasses. And it's really the responsibility of rural block holders to control that fuel and have a fire resilient block landscape that they're living on. But it's a pretty common thing that if a government goes and tells particularly an independent landholder, you must do this, they're not always greeted with enthusiasm. But so the problem there was, how can you get people thinking for themselves and understanding themselves, this is my responsibility and the risk I'm in if I don't do something about it. So what we did was produce an online simulation game. I can provide this link as well. It's a really simple and fun online JavaScript-based fire application, which allows people to look at placing this gambgrass weed through the landscape, what they might do in terms of maintaining the fire breaks around their house. What if they don't do that? And then testing that under different fuel loads. And I'd run this in 3D. So I'd have a projector, put down a bucket of sand, 3D print little houses to create this sort of interactive and shared space. And formerly our local rural fire agency, Bushfires NT, they would do their community engagement days, and they'd sit at a table with a bunch of pamphlets waiting for people to come and talk to them so they could tell them what they had to do. They got very little engagement. They set up a really fun 3D projection augmented fire game where people can play, touch, burn, the kids get involved. People would flock to it. So they had the audience. And you almost didn't need to then tell them anything. People would play and through play, think, understand, and teach themselves. So for me, that was a really powerful tactic, not telling people, but getting people to think for themselves, teach themselves, and then they take that on as their own knowledge and will act on that. So that was incredibly useful, that approach. And similarly, when I create these sort of larger landscape scale simulations, it's about, and take them to Indigenous land management groups. For me, as much as possible, I hand over the technology, and the story that goes with that sits with the Indigenous ranger groups themselves. As much as possible, I try to step out of that engagement. And for them, it's as much as for talking within their own communities, but also talking with their partners. So, for example, I've been working for quite a while with a remote fire management Indigenous ranger group called Dambimangari in far west of the Kimberley, so far west of Western Australia. They partner with a non-for-profit NGO conservation group called Australian Wildlife Conservancy, who support their fire management, and making sure that they're both talking about the same thing and they're both understanding what the fire management plans. This tabletop 3D fire simulation approach has been really useful for not saying exactly what's going to happen, but opening up that conversation in a really sort of fun and shared space. Now, more recently, I've extended that work with a southern emergency bushfire management agency in Western Australia, Department of Fire and Emergency Management. And they generally invest quite heavily in the predictive fire simulation algorithms to support their engagement and help with their active fire planning. But they've got me to develop one of these fire simulation games for a country town a few hundred kilometres west of Perth. And once again, I've actually 3D printed this whole country town. 3D printed these sort of low forests, and then the massive wheat areas surrounding that town. I chuck down a bucket of sand or desiccated coconut, and it creates these sort of 3D spaces. And I'm always quite nervous, but I do my best to try and make the fire behaviour I'm representing fit with the narratives that I'm getting from these agencies, because it's the storytelling, it's the narrative that they can be used to support, which for me is important. And so I delivered this one quite recently and provided training to the agency, and for them it was perfect. They could see exactly how they could use this to support their volunteer firefighter education, to support their fireground planning and discussion. So it didn't need to be predictive, it didn't need to be accurate. It needed to illustrate what were the principles around the complexity of fire management and how you could get people talking together about what they might do in different situations. And people talking is the key to all of this. And creating these fun shared spaces where people talk, I think, is really important. I have a real issue with the development of these sort of VR-based technologies, which seem to be more about not getting people to look at each other in the eye, right, disconnecting people from each other again, making things more screen-spaced. I think it's really important that we move to have shared spaces where people can look at each other in the eye and they can talk about what they're saying and they can discuss the complexity of what they're doing together. For me, that's the key thing.
You've put together a huge piece of my life for me right there. Because people have asked me, you're a 18th century British literature major. What do you have to contribute to the fire knowledge base? And now I can say, well, according to Rohan Fisher, the most important part is the story and the narrative. And that is what influences people to change behaviors or to learn how to manage their own fire landscapes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as I said before, I mean, technology is key. The science and technology is key. But if people are not talking together about the same thing, not understanding each other, not learning from each other, then the science and the technology it doesn't help. It won't really change these sort of fundamental sort of underlying issues around understanding fire behaviour and working together for the same outcomes. Now, I don't know too much about some of the LA fires, which were big news recently, but I do get the impression that there's a long and interesting human, ecological, and political history to how those fires occurred. And it does annoy me at times when people jump on climate change as being the driving force of all of these fires. I am the strong belief that climate change is making everything more difficult, no doubt. But if that is your focus, then you really miss. If that's your only focus, you really miss some really important other drivers that are creating these fire-prone landscapes. You're also ignoring the fact that fire is an important part of most of the landscapes that we work in. Fire is not a bad thing, and we all need to continue to work on this larger global problem of climate change. But there are a more immediate and closer to home things we need to actually be putting a hell of a lot of energy into, which is increasingly to live in more risk-resilient landscapes.
So it's the conversation, not the AI and the cool tech toys, that will make the difference.
Yeah, it's the conversation, not the cool tech toys.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely. They are once again a distraction, and you could argue that AI, due to increase in the demand for fossil fuels, may be more of an exacerbation of some of the future problems that we have at the moment. But I find it fascinating. We sort of it's lazy. I sort of understand it, but it's sort of lazy in the sense that we are always hoping for salvation from an external, whether it be a god or the god of tech. We want something to come and save us. We're always hoping there'll be something else instead of us, instead of human beings thinking and talking and working together. I mean, it's that simple, but and maybe that's not sexy, but that's what it is. That's what we need, and none of these other things will mean anything unless we're talking together about the same thing and understanding the complex human ecological reality that we live in, the ambiguity of those of our future, and the need to work through uncertain times together. I mean, you're what's happening in the United States right now, writ large, is a problem with people not understanding each other and not being able to talk together and work through problems together. And you've got some really interesting sort of emergent properties around the complex system of large-scale politics in your country, and some big challenges ahead over the next couple of years, I think.
What would be your prescription for that?
Oh God, yeah, no, I wouldn't go there. I don't think it's a certain type of wildfire that you've got on your hands, a political wildfire, a social cultural division wildfire that that the resilience wasn't built into your system years ago, and you're almost going to have to let it burn out, I think, and see where it goes.
Well, we'll find out. But
that's right.
I love the thoughtful approach that you bring to this and the opportunity that you create for people to learn about this themselves so that they can have stewardship over their lands and their property from a perspective of being informed and being responsible rather than being mandated, dictated, and regulated, which never works. So thank you for that perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wonderful. I want to thank you so much for joining me today on the Fire Break. If folks would like to get more information, I'm going to post your link, but to give you an opportunity to tell me about your website.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll send through a few links. There are other links to the online fire simulations that people might like to have a look at, and also this the fire animation website. It's a fun, engaging sort of display of fire history across Australia, and it gives you a sense of the scale, what's being done.
Fascinating. Rohan Fisher from Charles Darwin University, Down Under. If you find yourself in Australia, look up Rohan. He's got some very, very interesting stuff going on there, and I really appreciate the thoughtful nature of your work. You've been listening to or watching, hopefully, or depending on how we look that day, maybe hopefully not watching, but just listening to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Till I see you at the next one, take care.